year and a half ago, I suppose, I heard that I'd got this big grant from the ERC, the European Research Council, for a 5-year project to study the history of yoga, in particular the physical bits of yoga. And I invited the 20 best scholars of yoga in the world, Sanskritists, so people working on Sanskrit texts that, from which we can learn about the history of yoga. And they all said yes. You know, it's absolutely fantastic, really like a dream come true. So these are texts that still are only available in manuscript form. So there's, you can't go out and buy a book about this text, you can't buy a translation, it's just available in manuscript form in libraries in India or around the world. And then we sit down and we try to make sense of them. So literally, puzzling over syllables or words, and sometimes we'll spend 10-15 minutes trying to work out exactly what's going on with one word, or how it fits into the meter of the verse.
Let's read. So the first verse, very nice. Sri Kantha Kantha Luthita Dhara Pallava Srihi Srinatha Bhakshashi Kritang Risharo Ruhasrihi Sri Vasayoni Mukha Pankaja Lochana Srihi Srihi Sri Prada Bhavatusha Jagato Malasrihi. On the basis of meaning, as well as on the basis of these metric patterns, and on the basis of grammar, and if we have different sources, like this manuscript is having one reading, another manuscript is having another reading, we can compare and choose, we can have some guess what is behind, and so on. Pariharya Moham, having removed the delusion, confusion of one's mind. Kritva Bapusthirataram, this is also maybe interesting, made the body firmer, steady. Sthirataram Pratyati Siddhim, a meditator, a yogin achieves, finally attains perfection.
Can I go back to the Vyasadhyaya?
Yeah.
I may have missed something. What was your suggestion?
Samasadhyaya, Vyasadhyaya. So, thinking that it would be too much elaborate.
Yes, I thought that, I agree with that, except that I suspect that it should be Vyasa Bhiya, I think. So something's gone wrong there.
Impossible, yeah. But as I told you, that the transmission is really problematic. Out of 400 verses, we have only 243.
So I come now to the question of philosophical underpinning. This is a rather big topic. But I try to, again, just say something very simple and elementary about it. You remember that the Purvapakshan, I had imagined him saying, well, they are all yogacharas or madhyamakas. In any case, they cannot possibly believe in the existence of external objects, including the body. External means external to mind. And far from believing those external objects to be real, they believe that their appearance is a symptom of error and is caused by our mistakes, let us say, or our habitual ignorance.
One of the texts I'm working on, a recent discovery, is that the earliest text to teach the practices of physical yoga was in fact composed by Buddhists. So I had to completely revise my understanding of the history of the whole tradition that I've been working on for 20 years or whatever. Hang on, suddenly the root text of it is Buddhist and not Hindu tantric. Hatha yoga is not a religion in itself. In fact, the texts are pretty non-sectarian. But at the same time, it's clear that this text was written within a Buddhist community.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dr. S.V.B.K.V. Gupta. I'm working for this Hatha Yoga project as a researcher to collect various manuscripts in India in different libraries. First, we take the references from the catalogs. Then we go to the libraries without mishandling them. It is very comfortable to scan them with our scanner. So we scan them and we use for the research work.
This will be a rather informal presentation. See, yeah, so this is one. Bauer dates it to the end of the 4th century, second half of second quarter. So what is particularly nice for me is that, since you have a whole leaf, you can see many features of early poetry that you don't see even in some of the oldest palm leaf manuscripts. This is a collection that is not, cataloged anywhere. This is a collection from Bengal. It was given by Evans Vance to Johnston and then here to the Bodleian. And it's kind of, it's made up of these Bengalese manuscripts. But I wanted to show you this. This is simply part of the collection which is not catalogued at all, and so nothing is known about it.
There's some great scholars at this workshop, but the real guru of all of us is Professor Alexis Sanderson, who was my PhD supervisor at Oxford. And he spent 7 years in Kashmir in the 70s living with a traditional tantric Shaiva guru, and he's then spent the rest of his life studying the traditions of tantric Shaivism. So Shaivism is like the worship of Shiva.
So I began looking in this literature to somehow build up an understanding of the historical process which led to the traditions I was studying in Kashmir, which were late, highly sophisticated, very learned traditions which rested on a long prehistory. So I've been trying in the last 40 years to expose that history, and to get some sense of how the religion developed and changed over the centuries. But there are other areas of Indian religion which have remained completely obscure, have not been looked at, and yoga is certainly one of them. And Jim Mallinson started getting into this area and did his doctoral thesis on a text which seems in many ways to be continuous with Shaiva yoga tradition. And so the question was, to what extent, how are these two bodies of meditative practice related? How has the Hatha yoga tradition, say, or the tradition of other yogic groups positioned itself in relation to these dominant cultural forms that the Shaivas developed? And in this way, through this careful analysis, looking at many unpublished texts, he's gradually built up a picture of how this trend in Indian religion became central and influential in many different sectarian groups, and how eventually it became mainstream. And then the rest of the text goes through each of these centers and tells the yogin what he will hear as proof of the fact that he's now penetrated this level. Of course, because the words are non-semantic, because they are onomatopoeic, the manuscripts have trouble with them. Because they're not, as it were, in the dictionary. So there are quite a few variant readings, which is a problem for a yogin who's listening out for the required sound. Did I hear shimmy shimmy or simmy simmy? And are you sure it was dumu duma? So it's like when you put your hands against your ears, you hear some subtle sounds inside, but they're supposed to change as the mantra rises through these levels until it departs from the body. So I take the lead of the venerable feet of Abhinavagupta. Iti natra vivadbir asmabhyam asuyitavyam. I pray that the learned will not be too angry with me. I wanted to end with that because I think it does show that the tradition is undergoing constant transformation. But the sad thing is, I always feel as a student of Shaivism that in the background is something even more weird and interesting, which I can't quite reach through the texts.
So Stroman notes the curious divisions of the Sri Tattvanidhi and the confusions in the texts, such as asanas being referred to anaphorically before they're described and illustrated, which shows that they've moved around. The Hatha Paddhati has 112 postures, while the Sri Tattvanidhi has 122. 6 of the extra postures here, 75 to 80, are simple classical seated postures. So Sukhasana, Singhasana, Bhadrasana, Virasana, Padmasana, and Siddhasana, ending with Siddhasana as number 80. And the poses after 80 are said to be additional. So all those extra poses of the Hatha Paddhati sort of are dumped at the end. And I think this indicates clearly that the compiler had an agenda to make a set of 80 asanas. He believed that there should be, the grouping, there should be 80 asanas and they should end with Siddhasana and these other poses. Which strengthens, I think, the hypothesis that the reordering of the HAP's postures in the Sri Tattvanidhi was a conscious and intentional choice by the redactor, if not a wise choice.
We have, of course, complex asanas, but also quite a physical type of pranayama, where the breath is manipulated, the inhalation, the exhalation, lengthened perhaps, and the breath held. Well, in Hatha Yoga, it's more similar to some of the karanas in the sense that, but there's different terminology. They're not called karanas, they're called bandhas, and they're integrated with the phases of the breath. So as the yogin breathes in, he, at the end of the inhalation, applies the chin lock and the root lock. He grips the anus and squeezes the chin like this, and then he draws the navel in and up towards the spine, which causes the diaphragm to hyperextend. He does this while holding the breath. Then at the end of the breath retention, he releases the chin lock, but then actually exaggerates the hyperextension of the diaphragm using Uddiyana Bandha, and then holds Uddiyana Bandha while breathing out. And this enables the practitioner to breathe out for a very long period of time.
There are many forms of yoga, and very important in the history of the evolution of yoga is the Shaiva Tantras. You sit in a posture which is conducive to meditative activity, and then you concentrate on God. And there are a lot of breathing exercises, but no complicated stretching exercises. And a lot of ritual, in fact, tantric ritual involves things that you're doing really with your mind. You're not, so you cultivate the divinity in your heart, which is of course not the physical heart, but this imagined heart in your yogic body. And before you project the same divinity that you will worship in an outside substrate.
So there's all sorts of different approaches to these texts, to the history of yoga. For some people it's much more personal in terms of how they're going to apply these things. And for others it's maybe a more intellectual academic pursuit. But those two don't have to be in opposition. And I think for these Sanskrit intellectuals or authors themselves, this is an interesting question of, were they themselves practitioners, those who wrote these texts, or were they simply academics? I'm inclined to think that they were practitioners often themselves, based on the content and the exquisite details of these postures, some of which we saw today. You can see that a lot of this information would have only been written by somebody who had actually tried and sort of tested these things out.
Yoga today is quite contested. You know, what is it? There are so many different traditions.
So there's Iyengar Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, Bikram Yoga, Shivananda Yoga, Hot Yoga, Flow Yoga, Power Yoga, all these kinds of yoga, and then there's Hatha Yoga.
It was really interesting to see them using their knowledge of their bodies and what their bodies could do, and have that help us interpret the text. And it was intoxicatingly beautiful to watch, wasn't it? To hear the Sanskrit, to see them practice.
Kurpura paryantau hastau dharam avashthabhya januni nabhau sankunchya tishtet chatakasanam bhavati. Supporting oneself on the ground with the hands as far as the elbows. Kurpura paryantau hastau. Bend the knees at the navel and remain thus. This is the Chataka asana, the sparrow posture. So I read the Sanskrit and I translate it. I have no idea what I'm going to see when I look to the left sometimes.
This is Iyengar himself here. This is Gita Iyengar, and I think this is so his daughter and his son Prashant, I think, number 3 along on the wall there. And this is the kind of things that people still get up to in Iyengar yoga studios today. So he very much, I think, pioneered the use of ropes. In her book, Gita Iyengar's book, Yoga Gem for Women, of 1983, Iyengar's daughter described 7 rope postures, referring to the technique as Yoga Kurunta, strangely, and translating Kurunta as puppet, because the practitioner resembles a puppet on a string.
Okay, so my name is Daniela Bevilacqua and I am a team member of the Hatha Yoga project. Actually, I am the ethnographer of the group. My purpose is to collect information about the ascetic practitioners of Hatha Yoga in India today, to put together the development of the practice over the centuries and to create comparison between what is written in the text, what is represented in the temples, and what they are doing like today. Many sadhus appreciate the fact that we are actually working on this kind of project because yoga is a very important element of Indian religiosity. And then they were very helpful with my questions. They gave me a lot of examples. But on the other side, there were also the skeptical sadhus that don't understand this kind of research because they think, of course, for them, yoga is more a religious discipline. It's something that cannot be understood simply reading or talking about it, but has to be experienced. And so it will be a bit more difficult to get information from this kind of ascetics, but I'm quite good in that. Yeah, I mean, that's it. This is my work till now. So let's see the next time what will happen. If I will be still alive, who knows? After Kamakya, let's see.
After Kamakya.
Yeah, after Kamakya, it can be
they
scary.
avoid female victims, I think.
Oh, thank God, not a goat.
One thing I would like to add is just to acknowledge how incredible a workshop like this is and what an exciting time it is for yoga studies. We can almost take it for granted being at a conference like this to have such a learned audience and group of scholars, of Sanskritists, of specialists in yoga and Indian religious traditions all come together. But this is actually something quite new and novel that's happening right now, and it really speaks to the work that folks like Dr. James Mallinson and Jason Birch and Mark Singleton are doing. I mean, 10 years ago, this was not happening. If I told somebody I was getting a PhD in yoga studies, they would just scoff and laugh at me. But today, it's actually really earning the respectability in the academy. And as we can see with a grant like the ERC, even from the European Union and the Research Council, it's actually getting funded at the government level. So it's almost like in the medieval period when you'd have kings who were patronizing some of these Brahmin intellectuals to write these texts. Today, the government is actually paying scholars like Jim and Jason and Mark to study, to analyze and contextualize these texts.
It's been a really good process of looking at the materials and trying to incorporate that into my practice and how that would feel in the body. Started off just reading them going, this doesn't make sense, how do you get your ear to your thingy? And I'm used to learning in a very traditional manner where it's taught sequentially, you're given a posture by your teacher, he might demonstrate it, but usually they just tell you what to do. And then you practice that for years before you get something else, and you're expected to get a good level of proficiency before you move on to the next one. So to come to a written sequence with no person to guide and no person to demonstrate, it's been a totally different experience from how I normally practice.
Yeah, I'm really happy with the way the week went. So we kind of covered various extremes of scholarly endeavour, from the highest flown philosophy to just basic philology, what we call trying to make sense of text. Learning is collaborative. You know, you can't do this stuff on your own. You need to build on the work of others. There are a lot of students here who have just been in awe of these absolute kind of masters of Sanskrit scholarship who've been at it for 20, 30, 40 years at the top of their game. And they'll be inspired by that, and they'll make relationships, and then they'll start their own research projects and so forth. And yeah, so this, hopefully this will kind of keep the tradition of this kind of scholarship invigorated as well.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for me to attend and present about my work in the great Hatha Yoga project here in London at SOAS. It's really fortunate for me to express my views in front of advisory panel of Hatha Yoga project.
Yeah, for me it's very interesting, and because usually when I work we don't use text, because it's very rare that aesthetics are reading text. So for me it's very important, because then I can create a kind of comparison between these two approaches, not the textual and the practical. And then yeah, especially the last part, I mean, I will think and I will try to memorize what did they do, like the two girls, to see if I can see among aesthetics this kind of practices.
It's been a really exciting week to be a part of, to come along to the discussions and to hear the enthusiasm and the expertise with which all of these people are sharing. They really are sharing where they're at and what they've been working on for so many years on different texts. So to be a part of that and to see it is thrilling.
Well, the workshop is great in the sense that it might have seemed very disparate, and it might have seemed a lot of it very philological, but that's because there are so many different schools of yoga, and some of them are rather more distant from modern yoga, and what we're trying to do is examine the roots of yoga, and those are in all sorts of different traditions. So many people had to come together, and we discussed many things that seemed really, really far from the yoga that people recognize today. And I thought that it was very good. It had more spectacular moments and slightly duller moments. Certainly some very unphotogenic moments, I would have thought.
Their way of combining the text and embodied practice and interviews with sadhus and images, it is groundbreaking.